Welcome to the Eric Brady podcast, Series 1, Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me, Episode 5, Bomb Shelters.
So as the country got ready for war, what signs did you see?
The first one was the building of the Anderson shelter at the bottom of our garden. It was named after Sir James Anderson, who was the politician in charge of the ARP Warden organisation. Other people have done the work, of course. A bunch of men came, dug a massive hole at the bottom of our garden, poured in concrete, installed a corrugated curved steel roof which went into those walls, forming a shelter 6 foot by 4 foot by about 7 feet in height. And then when everything was hardened off, earth was piled on top of it and along the sides in order to both act as additional protection and also as camouflage. In front of the shelter was the doorway, of course, and it had very thick timber doors, I recall. And about 3 feet in front of that was built a 2 brick thick wall, big enough to cover all that in order to give additional protection. So when the bombers came, we could run out into the garden, behind the wall, get into the shelter, close the door, and would be safe.
I've seen they were also sometimes built on the surface with sandbags around them and earth on the top to protect them. There's one at the Tilford Rural Life Centre. And I found an old Ministry of Information picture on Wikimedia, which I've put on the YouTube version of the podcast, which shows a shelter after the houses around it have been bombed and blasted into smithereens, but the shelter survived, as did the 3 people sheltering inside it. So certainly potentially life-saving for those with gardens.
Because a lot of people in London and other big cities didn't have gardens for Anderson shelters to be put in, the Morrison shelter was built. That was named after Herbert Morrison, who was the Home Secretary at the time, but again other people did the work. There was a lady in the Home Office whose job was shelters, and she was very worried about the people in flats. And it said that Morrison got a bunch of shelter designers, said to them that they were going to be locked in a room, be provided with food at intervals until they came out with a viable plan, because he thought these designers would go on for days before producing anything that was useful. It worked because it was done and designed within 12 hours. Churchill backed him in this strong measure. What it was a 6x4 sheet of thick steel, and it was on very strong 4 legs, again metal of support, and on each side were sheets of mesh. One side could be raised for the people to be able to get in, and that sheet of steel would be put on the table, so it acted as table as well. And so when the bombers came, for those with the Morrison shelters, they could get into those and be safe. The only trouble was they were not designed and starting to be put into place until 1941, and there'd been an awful lot of bombing before that time. The other thing that was pretty much a drawback was that you will get in, bring down the side that could be raised to get out again, but if your house was destroyed on top and the bricks all cascaded down, could you always push up that mesh to be able to get out? Or how could you reach the rubble to push it aside from inside that? You had to wait for rescuers. And if the house was on fire, that was really problematical. Those were the indoor shelters. The proof of these shelters, Anderson shelters, being so safe and strong was when a sea mine was tied to parachutes and they were dropped from the aircraft, so they formed a massive, massive bomb. One of those hit the block of flats that was directly behind our house, totally demolishing that, and our shelter survived. The people in the flats, though, also had shelters to go to, for those particular flats anyway. There was a big grassy area between the block of flats in one street and the block of flats in another, and 3 big underground shelters had been put in there. And so when the bombers came, the inhabitants of those flats could go into those shelters.
So what measures were taken for schools?
They also had shelters underground in some way or another. The head teachers would do specific training for all the children in the school to dash to those. And in Sandhurst Road School, where I was later a victim, the headmistress had got the children so trained that the entire school could be evacuated into those shelters within 3 minutes. It was a different story when the bombers actually came to hit Sandhurst Road School, in which I was injured and Kitty was killed, because we had no time to get to the shelters. They came in so low and so fast, there was no air raid warning. So when the bombers came on and hit Sandhurst Road School, and we had no time to get to the shelters, the teacher just screamed to us to get under the trestle tables, which we were having our lunch at. And trestle tables being what they were pretty flimsy.
To buy your copy of Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me to read alongside the series, go to ericbradybooks.co.uk. The Eric Brady podcast can be found on YouTube, podcast services, and at ericbrady.blogspot.com.